Okay, thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to our second Records Roundup. My name is Maureen Plensky, and today Stacy Hutchinson and I will be focusing on the archives records that trace the history and slavery and servitude in Chester County. Before we get started, just a few quick reminders. The Chester County History Center has several upcoming programs. The Underground Railroad and Westchester walking tours are filling up, so check out the available dates if this interests you. Next week, on July 1st, the History Center is also offering a virtual program featuring John Smith, public historian and former Chester County archivist. He will discuss the life and legacy of Chester County's forgotten founding father, John Morton. If you enjoy these programs, a Chester County History Center membership might be a great gift idea for yourself or someone you love. Not only does it give you VIP access to events, but it also gets you into most of CCHC's programs either for free or at a discount. Finally, if you have any questions during the program, feel free to drop them in the chat box. And throughout the duration of the program, I will be leaving my video off, but once we get to questions at the end, you'll see me pop up. So before I get into our collections, I'll just share a brief history of the Chester County Archives. The archives formed in 1982, the year of the county's tricentennial, when a partnership was established between the County of Chester and the Chester County Historical Society, which of course is now known as the Chester County History Center. The goal of the partnership was, and continues to be, to preserve and make available the historic records of the Chester County government. Currently located at the Government Services Center in Westchester, the Chester County Archives holds over 3,500 cubic feet of original public records, of which 40% has been digitized. It's important to note that county records are collected and maintained following Pennsylvania state law, which can both be a positive and a negative. The negative is that unless mandated to do so, county governments do not create and keep records. However, the positive is that theoretically these records were collected across all Pennsylvania counties. So if your family hails from a different part of the state, you can follow those records through. To access the archives website, where you will find the records we are discussing today, you can navigate to the county's homepage at chesco.org. Then hover or click over the Government tab. Then select Archives and Records, which is listed under the Department heading. And you may already be familiar, this is the Archives homepage. To explore our collections, just click the top hyperlink, Records, Guides, and Indexes. Our records, guides, and indexes are organized by subject, and indexes, images, and information about each collection are available via the links on this webpage. And listed among our records, guides, and indexes is our collection of servant and slavery records. As Stacy and I will discuss in detail, this collection includes petitions filed by freedom seekers, manumission records, and a registry of enslaved persons. Many of these records were created due to acts that were passed by the Pennsylvania General Assembly or by the federal government. So specifically, we'll be talking about 4 acts in our presentation today, including the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, the Act to amend and explain gradual abolition, which was passed in 1788, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and the 1820 Act to prevent kidnapping, each of which created records for those who were enslaved in Pennsylvania. We would also like to quickly note that the Archives collections and records are named in accordance with their originating department. Therefore, we will be discussing records that include outdated language. For instance, the Clerk of Courts in Chester County kept a registry of enslaved persons, which they refer to as the Slave Register. Our records, guides, and indexes maintain this naming. So in 1780, Pennsylvania became the first state to pass a Gradual Abolition Act. Most notably, it declared those born to enslaved mothers before March 1st, 1780, to be enslaved for life, while those born to enslaved mothers after March 1st, 1780, were considered servants and were bound to serve until their 28th birthday. The act also banned non-residents from keeping enslaved people in Pennsylvania for more than 6 months, and it outlawed the importation of enslaved people. To ensure that no people were imported from outside the state, the act required enslavers to send a record identifying those they enslaved to the Clerk of Courts. If an enslaved person was not registered by November 1st, 1780, they were considered free. This slave register, as it was called by the Clerk of Courts, is available as an index on our website. You can access this register by clicking the link to our servant and slavery records, which is here. Then clicking the link to the 1780 register, which will send you to our indexes page. Among those listed in the register is James Boyd. He served on the Pennsylvania General Assembly when they voted on the Gradual Abolition Act. Himself an enslaver, Boyd voted against the act. Shown here in our index, he enslaved four Black children. The registry shares that Boyd enslaved a 15-year-old boy named Jack, a 12-year-old girl named Han, a 9-year-old girl named Jens, and a 4-year-old girl named Rose. Each of these children were deemed as a slave for life. In 2021, archivists at the Chester County Archives mapped the population of enslaved people in the county using the 1780 register as a reference. Boyd held property in Londonderry and Oxford townships, which were both regions that were heavily populated by enslaved persons. Led by the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, abolitionists successfully petitioned the Pennsylvania legislature to amend the 1780 Gradual Abolition Act. The 1788 Act to explain and amend gradual abolition addressed loopholes in the original law. It banned Pennsylvania enslavers from taking enslaved pregnant women out of state so that their children were born into slavery. It also prohibited the separation of enslaved families and required enslavers to register those born to enslaved mothers with the Clerk of Courts before the child was 6 months old. These records, known as servant returns, are also held within the archives collections. You can also access these returns by clicking the link to our servant and slavery records and clicking on the link to servant returns. Servant returns include important details about an enslaved person, such as their name, race, age, and date of birth. Returns also identify the enslaver, their place of residence, and the date that the record was filed. Boyd, for instance, filed a return for an enslaved boy named Levi in 1810. According to this return, Levi was enslaved by James Boyd, who resided in Londonderry Township. He was bound to serve until he turned 28 years old, and when the return was filed in January 1810, Levi was just three months old. He therefore was probably born in October or November of 1809, and due to the nature of these records, we know that Levi was the child of an enslaved mother. Servant returns may also include rich genealogical information. This return, filed by James Moore, shared that John Spence was born on November 5th, 1800. Spence was the son of July, who was also enslaved by Moore. Another return, filed by Margaret Hayes, shared that Zemaya, who was the son of her servant girl named Zella, was born on August 25th, 1821. Our collection of servant returns are not only indexed, but are also available online through our digital collections site. To access scans of these records, click the Images tab, which is located next to the Indexes tab, and then click the link listed below. While the 1780 Register and servant returns focus specifically on a person's term of enslavement, there are other records that may share details of an enslaved person's life. These records include wills, tax records, deeds, and newspapers. For instance, Rose, who was listed in the 1780 Register as a slave for life at the age of 4, she was freed by James Boyd when she turned 28 years old. As Stacy will discuss in greater detail, manumissions were often recorded by the Recorder of Deeds. James Boyd's will also reveals that he gave his wife, Mary, quote, the time of her black girl, unquote. The fate of this girl is not known, however, she does not appear in Mary's inventory when she passed in 1822, which was the following year. This suggests that the servant was not freed or sent to another enslaver. The inventory for James Boyd's estate also includes, quote, one black boy. This boy may have been Levi, who was just 11 or 12 at the time of Boyd's death. Because enslaved people were also considered as property, they are often listed in tax records. Boyd, who was a farmer, likely depended on enslaved people for agricultural labor, and by the early 1790s, enslaved persons from 12 to 50 years of age were considered taxable. When an enslaved person ran away, their enslaver often offered a reward for their capture in the press. In 1802, James Boyd offered $20 to anyone who secured his servant named Harry, who was then 20 years old, with 5 or 6 years remaining of his term. These advertisements included valuable detail about the activities of those who were enslaved. In this instance, Boyd shared that Harry was remarkably fond of playing the fife and was headed toward Philadelphia. While Harry aimed to escape Chester County, others, especially those who were enslaved in the South, view Chester County and Pennsylvania as a place of refuge. As Stacy will share in further detail, the archives collections also include records for those freedom seekers, so I'll turn it over to Stacy now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to begin with the later acts that deal with and the records here that deal with manumissions. So let's get started here with the Act of Congress of 1793. Even to this day, as it was previously mentioned, Pennsylvania counties only create and preserve records following Pennsylvania state law. However, state law is subject to federal law, and that included the Federal Slave Act, which was signed into law on February 12, 1793. This law permitted enslavers and their agents to pursue and search for escapees in free states and required free states to deliver freedom seekers. Pennsylvania's location and Chester County's location along Pennsylvania's southern border vis-a-vis Delaware, Maryland, and even Virginia, which at this time in U.S. history included present-day West Virginia, illustrates how Chester County was situated so as to be a place of freedom for those escaping the slave-holding states directly to the south. The Chester County Archives has two early petitions from enslavers from St. Mary's County and Cecil County, Maryland. These petitions were filed in 1805, and they resulted in two written commitments to the county's jail, which are pictured here. These commitments contain orders to detain two captured freedom seekers. Also shown here are the images of the jail keeper's docket, which record that Bob spent 15 days in jail and John was kept in safe custody for 105 days before being sent back with their enslavers. These early records show that the county not only complied with the federal statute, but also illustrate how the county did so. As Maureen mentioned, in 1820, 15 years after Bob and John were sent back to Maryland, Pennsylvania enacted a statute, an act to prevent kidnapping, that was in response to the federal Fugitive Slave Act. The act to prevent kidnapping specifically cites the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act and expressly prohibits officials from enforcing it. Pennsylvania was the first state to pass such an act. However, it also outlines how judges and recorders were to document these cases when they arose, thereby creating the records that were referred to as runaway slave petitions or fugitive slave records. The fair record of the case was to include the name, age, sex, and a general description of the freedom seeker, as well as information about the witness providing evidence. As per the statute, the fair record of the case was required to be filed with Chester County's Court of Quarter Sessions, thereby creating this collection. This collection contains 120 records and has been both indexed and digitized. These records can provide a lot of details about freedom seekers, including the physical description, an alias, and age and background information. Approximately 80% of the freedom seekers came to Chester County from Maryland, 9% from Delaware, and 6% from Virginia. If you would like to explore these records, they have been indexed and are searchable through both the freedom seeker and the enslaver who came to Pennsylvania. With the digital access that is now available to you, you can now view these records right from home by clicking on the Images tab. This is an early example of a fugitive slave record that was filed less than a year after the passing of the Act to Prevent Kidnapping. Each record consists of a target page that archive staff created, which lists the date of the record, as well as the name of the enslaver. But the record also records some of Stevens, the freedom seeker's history. Stevens states that he sought freedom about 5 years ago, and that he was unaware that he was now enslaved by James Blair. In 1826, Pennsylvania enacted a personal liberty law. Like the 1820 statute, the personal liberty law cited the 1793 federal law and did not interfere with it. It opens with a specific definition of kidnapping and sought to provide protection against slave catchers who came to Pennsylvania and kidnapped free people. This act required agents to show documentary evidence establishing the enslaver's claim beyond his own oath or testimony. Furthermore, it prescribed the format of the warrant that was issued. As with the 1820 Act, an alderman or a justice of the peace was specifically instructed not to take cognizance or jurisdiction. Coming just a few years after the 1826 Personal Liberty Law, this example from 1829 reveals the experience of Samuel Richardson, a freedom seeker from Newcastle, Delaware. He is described as 5'9" or 5'10" inches tall, slender in build, and skilled in husbandry. The petition also states that Samuel will be freed, but not until he reaches the age of 28. Samuel was only 26 years old. In addition to details about the freedom seeker, the records often include depositions from those who state that they recognize or know the freedom seeker. Typically, the depositions are provided by family members and neighbors of the enslaver, as in Samuel Richardson's case, where the deponent was Gunning Bedford Riddle, who was the son of the petitioner James Riddle, Esquire. Beyond a physical description, in some of these petitions might also provide you with background information about a freedom seeker, like Bill Hopkins. In his deposition, George Biddle shares how Bill and his mother were both enslaved by Dr. James Scanlon, the brother of the petitioner Catherine Scanlon. The deponent also recounts that Bill's mother died while enslaved to Dr. Scanlon, and that sometime before the doctor's death, Bill was enslaved by Catherine, who hired him out to work in Cecil County, Maryland, from whence he sought his freedom. We also learn from the petition that Catherine was from Philadelphia. In some instances, you may even find genealogical information about freedom seekers, as in the case of Daniel and Elijah. The deponent in this case was the neighbor of William Anderson, Esquire, the enslaver of Daniel and Elijah. We learn that Elijah and Daniel are half-brothers, and we even learn that their mother's name is Rachel, and that she was enslaved by Joshua Anderson, who is the father-in-law to William Anderson, Esquire. This last example from 1836 follows the prescribed format that was outlined in the 1826 Act and applies to the Justice of Peace in London Grove Township, seeking to recapture 11 freedom seekers. 3 of these freedom seekers are Charlotta and her 2 children, Eli, age 6, and Hannah, age 2, Hannah Jane, age 2. Pictured here is the affidavit of Mary Green, which is the name chosen by the freedom-seeking Charlotte or Charlotta, as she was identified in the previous slide. Mary states that she had been manumitted by Stephen Rigdon 4 or 5 years ago, and that she had filed her manumission papers at Bel Air in Harford County, Maryland. The proceedings were delayed for several weeks so that Mary could gather her evidence and her witnesses. There is no paperwork in the record to indicate that Mary was able to retrieve her manumission papers. However, in the meantime, the agents had been able to visit the courts of Harford County, Maryland, to retrieve their own evidence that Stephen Rigdon Sr. had been declared a lunatic after suffering a paralytic stroke several years ago. It was the agent's contention that Mary fled with her children at that time. Without proof of her manumission, Mary and her children were taken back to her enslaver. As in Mary Green's case, having access to your manumission papers was of paramount importance to free people of color. Pictured here is the earliest freedom certificate filed with the Chester County's Recorder of Deeds by John Alexander of London Britton Township. The freedom certificate was issued for Hector and Sally in 1758. Before we begin exploring the manumission records, I want to explain how the index to the records work, which you will find under the servant and slavery records under Records, Guides, and Indexes on the Archives website. Manumission records have been indexed and are searchable online. However, manumissions were recorded in a variety of ways. As you can see, that illustrated here in a page from the online index. When we look more closely at the references cited in the book column, you can see the difference. Any reference with just a letter or a letter followed by a hyphen and a number refers to a deed book. If the reference cited is just a number, then the manumission was recorded in a miscellaneous deed book. Finally, if the book reference is a letter followed by the words L of A in parentheses, then the manumission was recorded in a letter of attorney. Under the Images tab, you can find the hyperlinks to the deed books, miscellaneous deed books, and letters of attorney. Deeds, miscellaneous deeds, and letters of attorney were all recorded by Chester County's Recorder of Deeds, which is one of the oldest offices in Chester County. The Recorder of Deeds has served the residents of Chester County since 1688. Most of the manumissions were recorded in deed books. Pictured here in the lower right-hand corner is the 1758 Freedom Certificate for Hector and Sally that you saw a few slides ago. But let's take a closer look at it. Hector and Sally were manumitted on April 21st, 1758. In the upper left corner is the Freedom Certificate for Hector and Sally's son, Hector Jr. In Hector Jr.'s Freedom Certificate, John Alexander affirms Hector and Sally's freedom and states that Hector Jr. was born after their manumissions, and that it is his desire that Hector Jr. was to be free-born. While all of these details are remarkable pieces of information about Hector and Sally, there is one additional detail that John Alexander shared in this Freedom Certificate that I want to highlight. It's Hector Jr.'s date of birth. We see here that Hector Jr. was born on June 24th, 1758, and that's quite a find in any record of this early date. This isn't the end of what we can learn about Hector and Sally's manumissions. Pictured here is a record from Chester County's Court of Quarter Sessions, which shows that in May of 1758, John Alexander was required to provide surety of 60 pounds to the township of London, Britain, in case Hector and Sally were unable to support themselves. Another place where manumissions were recorded was in the miscellaneous deed books, which contain a variety of private transactions that required official documentation. You will find leases, bills of sale, releases, receipts, marriage contracts, and manumissions, among others. Prior to 1821, these transactions were recorded in deed books. This is an example of a manumission recorded in 1858. In this manumission, we learn about Simeon, Adeline, Laura, and Henry, who were manumitted by Joseph Parker and David White, two trustees of the yearly meeting of the Society of Friends in North Carolina. We learn that at the time of the manumission, that Simeon was 18 years old, Adeline was 16, Laura was 13, and Henry was 7. We also learned that Simeon, Adeline, Laura, and Henry were descendants of a family who had been transferred to the trustees of the Society of Friends by Richard Ratliff in 1813. The manumission also reveals that Simeon, Adeline, Laura, and Henry were to be freed either in Pennsylvania or New Jersey. Finally, the manumission equivocally states, "We do hereby, under the authority vested in us by the Society of Friends as aforesaid, liberate and set free from slavery or ownership them the said Simeon, Adeline, Laura, and Henry, and each of them in order that they may enjoy the free life." Letters of attorney are another record group where manumissions are located. A letter of attorney is a document through which a person appoints another to legally act on his or her behalf. They are commonly drawn up by individuals who have business or property in one area but live in another, or by individuals who are unable to complete transactions themselves. This manumission freed Peter from his enslaver, Eleazar David of Newcastle, Delaware, in 1809. We learn that Peter was freed because Richard Strode Jr. of East Bradford Township paid $130 for Peter to be absolutely discharged and set free from slavery. Along with the manumissions recorded in the Recorder of Deeds, you will also find manumissions in wills. The Archives collection of wills and administrations range from 1714 to 1923. This example of a manumission that was recorded in a will dates from 1746. As with the fugitive slave records, we created a target page for these records when we digitized them. In this will, William Brown leaves Jenny her freedom and sets her perfectly at liberty. He also leaves her a bequest of goods, including her bed and bedding, a chest, and all her wearing apparel. If this program has piqued your interest in these records, you might want to explore several history projects that were created by the Archives in 2021. The first is a story map about slavery in Chester County, and the other is a 20-minute video presentation entitled For the Price of His Wife, which tells the story of Jacob and Sal Glasgow. You can access both projects through the History Projects hyperlink on the Archives homepage under the Older Projects tab. The Archives is open for walk-ins Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 4. Please feel free to stop by, call us, or email us. We also now offer a virtual reference option, Ask an Archivist, which is a 30-minute reference consultation with Maureen or me. Before we close the program by addressing any questions, we're posting a link to a feedback form in the chat box that will help us to plan for future programs. If you wouldn't mind, please take a moment to complete it. It's very brief, I promise. And now we will open the program to address any of your chat box questions. Maureen, do we have anything?
So we have one question asking if we have records for indentured servants, either here at the Archives or at the History Center.
We do have indentured servant records. They are also listed under that same tab where you will find the records that we dealt with or addressed today. So please feel free to explore those. They were out of the scope of this program, but they are available on our website.
If you have any other questions, you can feel free to drop them in the chat.
Let's see. What ways there's a question, in what ways do you see falsified records where enslavers may have been attempting to circumvent the 1780 abolition or other acts of law? Ooh,
So that is a great question. I was searching for instances in the Chester County Court of Quarter Sessions, and most of those cases deal with people who are running away from their enslaver, but I did not see any instances, at least within Chester County, of an enslaver who is punished or fined for trying to circumvent that law.
And I will just speak to the example I had with Mary Green. The timetable of when those representatives for Stephen Rigdon came to Chester County was a little suspicious to my mind. But again, because they were Maryland residents, I didn't go into the Maryland records to see and verify what was going on. So, that was an interesting story that I uncovered. And so, it was her word against theirs. And having had Stephen Rigdon declared incompetent or an imbecile gave them the legal right to reclaim her. So it raised my antenna a little bit, but again, there was no proof here in Chester County. Okay, I think we've got lots of thank yous. But if anyone does not have any further chat questions, why don't we will end the program. You can feel free to reach out to us with any subsequent or follow-up questions. We do appreciate your time today, and thank you for attending, and wish you all the best. Thank you, everyone. Gonna stop recording.